Chapter 1. The Brother They Left Behind. The first thing I heard was the sound of the shelter door locking. Not closing. Not getting stuck. Locking. The heavy metal bolts slid into place while I stood on the other side of the emergency entrance, covered in blood, carrying the antibiotics that could have saved my father's life. I remember staring through the reinforced glass window and seeing the faces of the people I had spent my entire life protecting. My father was inside. My sister was inside. My family was inside. And they were watching me die. For 32 years, I believed family was the one thing in the world that could never abandon you. I was wrong, because when the world ended, the people I trusted most decided I was the easiest person to sacrifice. And the worst part was, I almost died believing they had no choice. 37 days after the beginning of the apocalypse, Seoul was no longer the city I remembered. The streets that once carried millions of people were silent. The lights that filled the buildings every night were gone. The only things moving through the empty roads were abandoned vehicles, desperate survivors, and creatures created by the disaster everyone called the Red Winter event. The Hollows. Nobody knew exactly where they came from. Nobody knew why they appeared. All people knew was that normal life ended the moment they arrived. The government collapsed within weeks. Emergency shelters became the only hope left. And people like me became nothing more than numbers. Resources, food, medicine, space. Everything had a limit. That was the excuse they used. That was the reason they gave me when they left me outside. But before that day, I was the person who kept them alive. My name was Kang Min-jae. Before the apocalypse, I worked as an emergency logistics coordinator for a disaster response company in Seoul. It was not a glamorous job. I was not a soldier. I was not a politician. I was not some powerful person who could control the world. I was just the person who made sure supplies reached the right place at the right time. Hospitals needed medicine. I handled the routes. Emergency centers needed equipment. I managed the inventory. Natural disaster happened somewhere. I was one of the people working behind the scenes while everyone else saw the rescue workers arrive. I knew warehouses. I knew transportation networks. I knew how fragile a system could become when even one small part failed. But my family never saw that value. To them, I was simply the person who handled problems. When my mother died, I became the person who took care of everyone. When my father's business failed, I paid the debts. When my younger sister Soo-jin struggled financially, I helped her finish university. Whenever something went wrong, everyone looked at me. Because I was reliable. Because I never said no. Because I always survived. That was the mistake I made. I allowed people to believe my strength meant I never needed anyone. The day I died, I was not trying to be a hero. I was trying to save my family one more time. My father had been injured during an attack near the evacuation district. The shelter medical supplies were almost gone. The doctors told us he needed antibiotics immediately. Without them, he would not last. I volunteered to leave. I still remember my sister grabbing my arm before I walked outside. "Appa, come back quickly." That was all she said. Not "be careful." Not "thank you." Not "I'm scared for you." Just "come back quickly." Because even then, she believed I would. She always believed that. Min-jae would handle it. Min-jae would fix it. Min-jae would survive. So I entered the destroyed streets alone. I fought through abandoned buildings. I searched medical stores that had already been looted. I risked my life for medicine. For them. When I finally found the antibiotics, I thought I had won. I thought I was bringing hope back. I was wrong. Because when I returned, the shelter was closed. At first, I thought something had happened. Maybe the power failed. Maybe the guards did not recognize me. Maybe they were fighting inside. I hit the emergency door. "Open the door." My voice echoed through the empty hallway. "Please. I have the medicine." Nothing. I hit the glass. Again. Again. Until my hands started bleeding. Then I saw movement. Someone walking toward the entrance. My sister. Soo-jin. For 1 second, relief filled my chest. I thought she would open it. I thought she would run to me. I thought she would remember everything I had done for her. But she stopped behind the glass. She looked terrified. Not because I was outside. Because she knew I was outside. "Soo-jin." My voice cracked. "Open the door." She looked away. That was when I noticed something. My father was behind her, alive. My family was safe. They had enough food. They had shelter. They had survived. Without me. Sujin, please. She pressed her hand against the glass, but she did not open it. Appa. Her voice was barely audible. There isn't enough space. I stared at her. I thought I had misunderstood. What? The shelter is full. I have the medicine. Dad needs this. Her expression changed. Not sadness. Fear. She was afraid of losing what she had. Appa, if we opened the door, everyone inside could die. I looked at my father, the man I had spent years protecting. He could not meet my eyes. That hurt more than anything. I looked back at Sujin. You knew I was alive. She said nothing. You knew I was outside. Still nothing. Then she whispered, I thought you would find another way. Those words stayed with me until the end, because in that moment, I understood something. They did not believe I was invincible. They simply believed my life mattered less. The infection came later. The hunger came after that. For 3 weeks, I survived alone. I moved between abandoned buildings. I drank dirty water. I slept in places where hollows could find me. Every day, I told myself I would make it. Not because I wanted revenge, because some part of me still wanted to believe there was a reason. A misunderstanding. A mistake. Something that would make their decision make sense. But there was no explanation. There was only the truth. My own family had chosen to live without me. On the 37th day after the apocalypse began, I collapsed inside an abandoned subway station. My body could not continue. My infection had spread. My supplies were gone. The city around me was silent. And for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to save everyone else. I closed my eyes. I remembered every sacrifice, every bill I paid. Every night, I stayed awake solving problems that were never mine. Every time someone said, Min-jae will handle it. Then I remembered the shelter door closing, the sound of those locks, the final choice my family made. My last thought was not anger. It was regret. I regretted spending my entire life proving I was useful to people who never valued me. Then everything went dark. I expected death. Instead, I heard a voice I had never heard before. Calm, cold, almost mechanical. If you were given another chance, the darkness around me shifted. Would you make the same choices? I could not answer. My body was already gone. My life was already over. But then the voice spoke again. Regression sequence activated. And suddenly, I felt something I had not felt in 37 days. Warmth. I opened my eyes, and I was lying in my own bed. The ceiling above me was familiar. The room smelled like my apartment. The sunlight coming through the window was impossible. Because I knew this place. I had not seen it since before the apocalypse. I slowly reached for my phone. My hands were shaking. The date on the screen made my entire body freeze. 30 days. 30 days before the Red Winter event. 30 days before Seoul collapsed. 30 days before my family left me to die. I sat there in silence. Because I understood. I had been given something impossible. A second chance. But this time, I was not going to spend it saving people who would abandon me. This time, I was going to survive first. Chapter 2. 30 days before hell. When I opened my eyes and saw the date on my phone, I waited for reality to correct itself. I waited for the pain in my body to return. I waited for the cold subway floor beneath me. I waited for the sound of hollows moving through the darkness. But none of it came. Instead, I was lying in my apartment. The same apartment I had left behind before the world ended. The same room where I had spent years waking up early, going to work, and solving problems for everyone else. For several minutes, I did nothing. I simply stared at the screen. The date was impossible. 30 days before the Red Winter event. 30 days before civilization collapsed. 30 days before I watched my family choose a world without me. I checked again, then again. The answer did not change. I was alive. Not just alive. I was back. The first thing I did was check my body. No infection. No injuries. No exhaustion. No scars from the month I had spent fighting to survive. My hands were clean. My clothes were normal. My apartment was untouched. It felt like a dream. But I knew better. Dreams did not come with memories of dying. I remembered everything. The hunger, the fear, the loneliness. The moment my sister looked at me through that glass door and decided I was expendable. That memory was still fresh. Too fresh. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked around the room. The old me would have considered this a miracle. The old me would have immediately called my family. I would have warned them. I would have told them about the apocalypse. I would have spent every second trying to save them. But I was not the same person anymore. The person who woke up in this room had already died once. And that person had learned the hardest lesson possible. Being needed was not the same as being loved. The first thing I did was confirm the timeline. I turned on the television. The news was normal. Traffic reports, weather updates, stock market information, people complaining about ordinary problems. Nobody knew what was coming. The world was still pretending tomorrow would look like today. A news reporter talked about unusual weather patterns developing across different countries. I froze. That was the beginning. The first warning signs. Scientists had noticed strange changes in global temperatures. Governments had started collecting information, but ordinary people ignored it. They always did. People believed disasters only happened to someone else. I knew better. I had already watched the world end. My phone rang. The name on the screen made my expression change. Kang Soo-jin, my younger sister. For a moment, I simply stared at it. In my previous life, seeing her name would have made me smile. No matter how busy I was, I always answered. She was my little sister, the person I had protected since we lost our mother. But now, I remembered another image. Her standing behind the shelter glass. Her choosing herself. The call continued ringing. The old me would have answered immediately. The new me let it ring. Eventually, it stopped. A few seconds later, a message appeared. Appa, can you send me money? I have some problems with my rent. I stared at the message. Something inside me hurt. Not because she asked, because I realized how automatic it had been. My entire life, my first reaction had always been, how can I help? I had never asked, why am I always the one helping? Another message arrived. It's urgent. Please don't ignore me. I closed the chat. Not because I hated her, because for the first time, I was thinking about myself. My father called next. I answered after several rings. Min-jae. His voice was familiar. Older. Tired. The same voice that had asked me for help countless times. Did you see my message? I looked at the screen. He wanted money. Of course he did. There was always something. A debt. A problem. A responsibility. Dad. I'm busy right now. There was a pause. Normally, that sentence would never have come from me. Busy? Yes. You know Soo-jin is having trouble. I closed my eyes. Even now. Even before the apocalypse. Nothing had changed. The moment someone needed something, my own situation became irrelevant. I'll think about it. My father sounded surprised. Min-jae, what happened to you? That question stayed with me, because I knew the answer. I died, but I could not tell him that. So I simply said, I'm tired, Dad. Then I ended the call. I spent the rest of the morning making a plan. Not an emotional plan. Not a revenge plan. A survival plan. The apocalypse was coming, and I knew exactly what would happen. My advantage was not strength. I was not a fighter. I was not someone who could defeat hundreds of enemies alone. My advantage was information. Before the apocalypse, I worked in emergency logistics. I knew how supplies moved. I knew which warehouses existed. I knew which emergency routes governments prepared. I knew where resources would be abandoned. In my first life, that knowledge helped me keep my family alive for weeks. In my second life, it would keep me alive. I opened my laptop. I created a list. Food, water, medicine, communication equipment, transportation, shelter locations, energy sources. Every item had a priority level. The old me would have prepared for everyone. This time I prepared differently. I was not building a rescue operation. I was building a foundation. For myself. The next few days passed quietly. To everyone around me, nothing had changed. I went to work. I answered emails. I attended meetings. I acted normal. But inside, I was counting down. 29 days. 28 days. 27 days. Every day, brought the world closer to collapse. At work, I visited the logistics department early one morning. The building looked exactly the same. The same employees, the same desks, the same routine. Nobody knew that in 1 month, most of these people would either be dead or fighting for food. My supervisor noticed me immediately. Park Jun-ho, 45 years old, a man who had spent his career managing disaster response systems. He was one of the few people who had always respected my work. Min-jae. He looked at me carefully. You look different. I smiled slightly. Different how? Like someone who stopped sleeping. I almost laughed. He was closer to the truth than he realized. I need access to old emergency inventory records. He raised an eyebrow. That's unusual. I'm preparing for possible disruptions. Disruptions? I nodded. Supply problems. Junho studied me for a moment. He was experienced enough to know when someone was hiding something, but he was also experienced enough to know when not to force answers. Fine. He opened the system. Tell me what you're looking for. I looked at the information appearing on the screen. Emergency storage locations, government supply routes, medical reserves, everything I needed. The same information that could have saved my family before. The same information I would use differently now. That evening, I returned home with a single thought. 30 days. That was all I had. 30 days before the world became a place where kindness without preparation was a weakness. 30 days before everyone started searching for the things I already knew existed. I opened my old family group chat. Messages filled the screen. My father, my sister, relatives, everyone asking, everyone needing, everyone expecting. I looked at it for a long time. Then I pressed one button. Leave group. For years, I had been afraid of disappointing them. Now I was afraid of becoming that person again. The person who gave everything away and died with nothing. That night, I made my first purchase. Not food. Not weapons, not medicine, something more important, information. I contacted old professional connections. I studied warehouse locations. I reviewed evacuation plans. I mapped Seoul, and for the first time in my life, I was preparing a future where I was not just someone useful. I was someone who mattered. The next morning, an email arrived from my workplace. The subject line immediately caught my attention. Government Emergency Storage Contract. Clearance required. I opened it. The details were familiar. Too familiar. Because I remembered this warehouse. In my previous life, nobody reached it in time. The supplies inside were lost. Thousands of people searched for resources that were already sitting there. But this time was different. I knew where it was. I knew when it would become inaccessible. And I knew exactly what I had to do. I closed the email. 30 days before hell arrived, I had found my first advantage, and this time, I would reach the supplies first. Chapter 3. The Man Who Stopped Begging for Family. The government emergency storage contract sat open on my laptop screen for almost 10 minutes. In my first life, I had looked at that same information and seen nothing more than another assignment. Another responsibility. Another problem someone needed me to solve. But after dying once, I saw it differently. I saw a chance. The warehouse mentioned in the contract was located on the outskirts of Seoul, connected to an emergency supply network designed for large-scale disasters. In normal circumstances, it was just another government storage facility. But after the Red Winter event began, everything changed. The roads around it became blocked. The communication network failed. The people responsible for transporting the supplies never arrived. The warehouse remained untouched while survivors across the city fought over scraps. I remembered that clearly, because during my first life, I had spent days searching for medicine while knowing that somewhere, the supplies I needed were sitting behind locked doors. I had no way to reach them. No authority. No preparation. No time. This time, I had all three. I went to work the next morning pretending everything was normal. That was the strangest part about returning to the past. The world was still ordinary. People complained about traffic. Employees argued about schedules. Customers worried about small inconveniences. Nobody knew they were standing only 30 days away from the end of everything they understood. I walked through the office carrying the same expression I had worn for years. Quiet, professional, reliable. But inside, I was calculating routes, storage capacity, time, risk. My coworkers saw the same Kang Min-jae they had always known. They did not know that the man walking beside them had already watched civilization collapse. Park Joon-ho was the first person who noticed something was different. He was my supervisor and one of the few people at work who treated me like a professional instead of just a convenient problem solver. He looked up from his desk when I entered his office. "You're early. I had something to check." He leaned back in his chair. "You have been different since yesterday." I smiled slightly. "Different? You're usually careful before making decisions. Yesterday you walked in here like you already knew the answer." His observation surprised me, because he was right. In my first life, I always waited. I analyzed. I considered everyone else's needs. This time, I already knew what was coming. I need access to emergency inventory records. His expression became serious. "That information is restricted." "I know. Why do you need it?" I looked at him. I could not tell him the truth. I could not say. Because in 30 days, the world ends. Because I watched millions of people die. Because I died because I was not prepared. So I gave him the closest answer I could. "I think supply chains are going to become unstable." He studied my face. "You think something is going to happen?" "I think people underestimate how quickly things can break." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he turned back to his computer. "You always were the person who noticed problems before everyone else." He entered his credentials. "Let's see what you found." The information appeared on the screen. Emergency storage locations, transportation schedules, medical reserves, food distribution routes. My eyes moved quickly. I knew most of this already, but seeing it again gave me something I did not have before. Time. I began creating a private map. Which warehouses were accessible? Which roads would remain open? Which locations would become dangerous? Which supplies would disappear first? Every detail mattered, because survival after the apocalypse was not only about having resources. It was about having the right resources before everyone else realized they needed them. Over the next several days, I quietly prepared. I did not buy everything at once. That would attract attention. Panic was dangerous. People noticed desperation. They noticed someone preparing for something they could not see. I moved carefully. Small purchases, multiple locations, different suppliers. I built a foundation without making noise. Food that could last, medical equipment, water purification systems, communication devices, tools. Everything had a purpose. Everything had a reason. But the hardest part was not preparing. It was changing myself. Because every day, my family reminded me of who I used to be. My father called again. My sisters sent messages. They needed help. They always needed help. Before my regression, I would have answered immediately. I would have transferred money. I would have solved the problem. I would have told myself that family came first. But now, whenever I felt that instinct, I remembered the shelter door, the metal locking, the glass between us, my sister's face, the moment she decided I was not worth saving. One evening, Soo-jin called again. I almost ignored it, but I answered. "Appa." Her voice sounded normal, like nothing had happened, like we were still the same people. "I need some help." I stayed silent. She continued. "It's not a big amount. I just have some expenses." "What kind of expenses?" There was a pause. "Just personal things." I looked around my apartment, the same place where I had once sat, and calculated how much money I could give my family while still paying my own bills. What if I can't help? Another pause. What? What if I have my own problems? Her voice changed. Not angry. Confused. As if the idea itself was strange. "You always help." That sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because it was cruel. Because it was true. I had trained everyone around me to believe I would always sacrifice myself. "I can't this time." "Appa, seriously?" "I'm sorry." The call became quiet. Then she said, "You've changed." I looked at the phone. Yes, I had. But not because I wanted to. Because I had finally learned what happened when I stayed the same. That night, I visited my family's apartment building. Not to help. Not to warn them. Just to see. The lights were on. My father was watching television. Soo-jin was sitting at the table. They looked normal, safe, comfortable. They had no idea what was coming. A part of me wanted to knock, to tell them everything, to warn them. The old me would have, but I stood there and remembered. If I told them, they would depend on me again. They would expect me to prepare everything. They would survive because of my work. And if something went wrong, they would still choose themselves. I walked away. For the first time in my life, I chose myself before them. 3 days later, I received another message from Park Jun-ho. A private emergency warehouse was scheduled for inspection. The location immediately caught my attention. It was one of the most valuable storage facilities in Seoul. In my first life, nobody reached it. The roads collapsed before rescue teams arrived. The supplies disappeared into the chaos. But now I knew exactly when everything would happen. I stared at the location on the screen. This was not just a warehouse. It was the first step toward controlling my own survival. I closed the message. The old Kang Min-jae spent his life arriving after everyone else. After problems started. After people needed him. After damage was already done. But that person was gone. This time, I would be there before the disaster arrived. Chapter 4. Taking everything before the world ends. The emergency warehouse was only a location on a map to everyone else. To me, it was a memory. I remembered walking past similar facilities during the first apocalypse, searching through empty stores and abandoned buildings while people fought over scraps of food. I remembered seeing desperate survivors break into places that had already been emptied. I remembered thinking the same thing every time. If only I had known earlier. Now I did. And that knowledge was worth more than anything sitting inside a bank account. The warehouse was located in an industrial district outside central Seoul. Before the apocalypse, it was just another government storage location. Large, secure, mostly ignored. After the Red Winter event, it would become a lifeline. Emergency food, medical equipment, water systems, communication supplies, everything needed to keep thousands of people alive. The problem was that nobody would know it existed until it was too late. Except me. I spent the next week building my preparation plan. I did not rush. That was something my first life had taught me. Panic destroyed more people than disasters did. When the apocalypse arrived, everyone would run toward the same obvious resources. Supermarkets, convenience stores, pharmacies, gas stations. Those places would become chaos within hours. The real value was hidden in places ordinary people ignored. Warehouses, distribution centers, emergency storage facilities. Places designed to support society during its worst moments. I knew where those places were. My first priority was survival. Not comfort, not luxury. Survival. I created a list. Food that could last for months. Medical supplies. Water purification equipment. Portable power sources. Communication devices. Tools. Protective equipment. Every item had a reason. Every item had a purpose. I was not preparing for a disaster. I was preparing for the collapse of civilization. One afternoon, I met Han Yirin. I had known her before the apocalypse. She worked with a different emergency response division and occasionally coordinated with my company. In my first life, I met her much later. By then, most people had already lost themselves. Fear had changed everyone, but Yirin had remained the same. Calm, professional, focused. A person who could look at a terrible situation and still think clearly. That was rare, especially after the world ended. I found her at a small medical equipment supplier. She looked at the list I was purchasing and immediately frowned. "You're buying a lot of emergency supplies." I looked at her. "I'm preparing." "For what?" I paused. I could not tell her about regression. Not yet. People did not believe impossible things, and I could not afford to waste time convincing everyone. "Something feels wrong." She crossed her arms. "That's not exactly a professional explanation." I almost smiled, because she sounded exactly like the person I remembered. Direct, practical, honest. "I work with emergency systems. I see patterns." She looked at the supplies again. "You really think something serious is coming?" "Yes." The answer came too quickly. She noticed. "You're certain?" I stayed quiet. After a few seconds, she sighed. "I don't know what you know, Min-jae." She picked up one of the medical kits. "But I know you're not someone who wastes money." That was the reason I trusted her. She did not blindly believe me. She simply understood that I had a reason. Together, we began checking emergency routes. I showed her areas that would become dangerous, places where roads would collapse, buildings that would become traps, locations where survivors would gather. She asked questions constantly. How do you know this? I study logistics. That doesn't explain everything. No. She looked at me. But it's enough for now. For the first time since my regression, I felt something unexpected. Not trust. Not completely. But relief. Because I was no longer carrying everything alone. However, while preparing, I discovered something that bothered me. Someone else was moving. Large amounts of supplies were being purchased across Seoul. Not random panic buying. Organized buying. Professional. The same way a company prepared inventory. I tracked the purchases through public records. Medical equipment. Industrial food supplies. Emergency technology. Someone else knew something, or at least suspected something. That was dangerous. I remembered this group from my first timeline. They were connected to private survivor compounds. Powerful people who had prepared before ordinary citizens knew anything. At first, I thought they were lucky. Later, I realized they were not lucky. They had information. The same disaster that destroyed millions of lives became an opportunity for people who were already prepared. The apocalypse did not create inequality. It exposed it. That night, I reviewed my plans again. The old me would have been angry. I would have thought, why did they know? Why did they prepare while others suffered? But now I understood something important. Anger was useless. Information mattered. Preparation mattered. Control mattered. If someone else was preparing, I needed to prepare better. 3 days before the apocalypse, I secured my first major storage location. Not the government warehouse yet. A smaller emergency facility that contained medical and survival equipment. I moved everything carefully. No attention. No unnecessary risk. No witnesses who did not need to know. The old Min-jae would have explained everything. He would have tried to convince people. He would have searched for approval. The new Min-jae understood something different. Sometimes the safest plan was the one nobody knew about. The night before the Red Winter event, I stood inside my apartment surrounded by supplies. For the first time, I was ready. Not completely. Nobody could ever be completely ready for the end of the world. But I was no longer helpless. My phone suddenly vibrated. An emergency alert appeared. I froze. I knew this message. I had seen it before, but seeing it again felt different. Emergency warning. Unidentified global disaster expected within 24 hours. The world had finally started noticing. People would panic soon. Stores would empty. Roads would fill. Everyone would begin searching for the things I had already secured. I looked at the message. Then I looked at the map on my wall. The warehouse. The supplies. The routes. Everything was ready. I whispered quietly, "This time, I won't arrive after everything is gone." Outside my window, Seoul continued living like normal. Cars moved through the streets. People walked home. Lights filled the buildings. They had no idea tomorrow would destroy everything. But I did. And tomorrow, I would move before the world understood what was happening. Chapter 5. The day the world broke. The emergency alert remained on my phone screen for several minutes. I already knew what it meant. I had seen this message before. I had watched people ignore it. I had watched them laugh at the warnings because the world outside their windows still looked normal. That was the most terrifying part of the apocalypse. Not the monsters. Not the destruction. It was how ordinary everything looked right before everything disappeared. The morning of the Red Winter event began like any other day. People went to work. Students went to school. Stores opened. Traffic filled the streets. Seoul was alive. Nobody knew they were standing at the edge of the end. I left my apartment before sunrise. My backpack was already prepared. Inside were the essentials I had collected over the past month. Medical equipment. Communication devices. Tools. Emergency supplies. Nothing unnecessary. Everything had a purpose. I moved through the city quietly, watching the people around me. A man drinking coffee. A woman talking on the phone. A group of students laughing together. In my first life, all of them had become strangers fighting for survival. Some survived. Most did not. This time, I could not save everyone. I had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. At exactly 8:17 in the morning, the first major failure happened. The communication networks went down. Not slowly, almost instantly. Phones lost signals. Internet connections disappeared. Traffic systems stopped responding. People looked around confused. At first, everyone assumed it was temporary, a technical problem, a government issue, something that would be fixed within hours. That was how disasters always started. People believed the old world was coming back. Until they realized it was gone, I headed toward the emergency storage facility I had prepared. The streets were already changing. People were leaving buildings. Drivers were stopping their cars. Everyone was trying to understand what was happening. Then the first reports appeared. Strange attacks, unknown creatures, missing people. The government tried to control the information. They failed, because within minutes, the entire city began seeing the truth. The hollows had arrived. I had seen them before, but seeing them again still felt impossible. They were not animals. They were not human. They moved with unnatural speed and attacked anything that crossed their path. During my first life, people had wasted precious hours trying to understand what they were. Those hours cost thousands of lives. This time, I did not hesitate. I already knew the rules. Avoid crowded areas. Do not follow emergency broadcasts blindly. Never enter a shelter without knowing who controls it. And most importantly, move before everyone else moves. I reached the storage facility before the crowds arrived. The security system was still active. The world outside was collapsing, but inside those walls, everything remained organized. Boxes, medical equipment, emergency supplies. Everything was exactly where I remembered. For a moment, I simply stood there. In my first life, I had walked through ruined streets begging for medicine. Now I was standing in front of supplies that could keep people alive. The difference was not strength. It was preparation. I loaded what I could and prepared to leave. That was when I heard screaming, not far away, outside. I looked through the entrance window. A group of civilians was running through the street. Behind them, a hollow moved through the abandoned vehicles. They had nowhere to go. In my first life, I would have rushed out immediately. I would have risked everything. That instinct was still inside me. But this time, I stopped. I calculated. Distance, risk, time. Then I moved. Not because I wanted to be a hero, because I knew exactly how many seconds I had. I reached the group before the hollow caught them. I guided them toward a safer route. I did not fight unnecessarily. I did not try to defeat everything around me. I simply used knowledge. A blocked street, a collapsed building, a hidden passage. Information saved lives. After helping them escape, I continued toward my destination. That was when I saw her. Han Yirin. She was trapped near a damaged building. A section of the structure had collapsed, blocking her path. In my first timeline, I never met her until much later. By then, she had already lost many people. But here on the first day, she was still the same person, still fighting, still trying to save others. I moved toward her. Yirin. She turned immediately. For a moment, surprise crossed her face. Min-jae. I pushed debris aside. What are you doing here? She looked at me like I was the one asking a strange question. Trying not to die. Despite everything happening, I almost laughed. That sounded exactly like her. We moved together through the city. The difference between us was simple. She knew how to save lives. I knew how the city would collapse. Together, those two things worked. We avoided dangerous areas. We avoided failed shelters. We avoided the places where thousands of people would soon become trapped. As we moved, Yirin kept watching me. Finally, she asked, "How do you know where to go?" I did not answer immediately, because I did not have an answer that made sense. So I said, "I studied emergency systems." She looked unconvinced. "That's not enough." "No." I looked toward the ruined streets ahead. "It isn't." She understood I was not ready to explain. Surprisingly, she did not push. By the evening of the first day, Seoul was no longer the city I remembered. Smoke filled the sky. Buildings stood damaged. Emergency sirens continued with no one left to respond. People were searching for help, but the systems they depended on were already breaking. I stood on the rooftop of an abandoned building and looked over the city. A month ago, this view had represented everything I wanted to protect. My career, my family, my normal life. Now it represented something else. A battlefield. Yirin stood beside me. What happens next? I looked at the city. I knew. The first shelters would open. People would rush toward them. Some would survive. Some would be abandoned. Some would discover that the greatest danger was not the hollows outside. It was the people inside. I thought about my family. I thought about my sister. I thought about the shelter door. Then I answered, things are going to get worse. Yirin looked at me. How much worse? I looked toward the darkness spreading across Seoul. Much worse than anyone expects. That night, a radio signal finally broke through. A government emergency broadcast. The message was short, cold, official. All civilians must move toward designated shelter zones immediately. Shelter capacity is limited. Individuals outside designated areas may not be accepted. I heard those words again. Shelter capacity is limited. The same excuse, the same sentence people would use to justify abandoning others. But this time I already knew what was coming, and I would not be standing outside that door again. Chapter 6. The family that expected him to save them. The government broadcast repeated the same message every hour. Move to designated shelters. Follow emergency instructions. Remain calm. To most people, those words sounded like hope. To me, they sounded like a warning, because I knew what happened inside those shelters. The world outside was dangerous, but the world inside was not always safer. A shelter could protect you from the hollows. It could also reveal exactly who people became when survival was on the line. I'd already learned that lesson once, at the cost of my life. The first 15 days after the apocalypse were a blur of movement. There was no time to rest. Every decision mattered. Every location mattered. Every person mattered. Yirin and I moved between temporary safe areas while collecting information. She treated injured survivors. I managed supplies and routes. We were different in almost every way. She trusted people more than I did. I trusted plans more than people. But together, we balanced each other. During those days, I kept thinking about one thing. My family. I hated that I still thought about them. After everything they had done, a part of me still wondered if they were alive, if they were safe, if they had survived. That was the frustrating thing about family. Even when someone hurt you, the connection did not disappear instantly. Memories remained. Years remained. Love did not vanish just because someone betrayed you. That was what made betrayal so painful. It came from someone who mattered. On the 5th day after the apocalypse, I found information about their location. A survivor group had mentioned a family matching their description near a temporary shelter zone in southern Seoul. My first reaction was anger. My second reaction was relief. They were alive. I hated that I felt relieved, because I remembered the first timeline. I remembered dying outside that shelter. I remember my last moments, but hearing they were alive brought back something I thought I had buried. The old me, the person who wanted to protect them. I decided to see them, not to help. Not yet. I told myself I only needed information. I needed to know what they were doing, how they survived, what choices they made. That was all. At least, that was what I told myself. I watched them from a distance. My father looked older, much older. The confident man who once believed everything would work out was gone. The apocalypse had removed that illusion. He moved carefully. He relied on others. He looked afraid. Soo-jin was different. She still looked like the same person, but there was something missing. The confidence she had before. The belief that someone else would always solve her problems. That was gone. She was searching, not for food, not for shelter, for me. I heard her talking to another survivor. My brother will find us. The words immediately brought back memories. My hands tightened, because that sentence was exactly who she believed I was. Not a person, a solution. He always does. I watched her face. She was not pretending. She actually believed it. She believed I would appear. She believed I would forgive. She believed I would do what I had always done. Save her. That night, Yirin noticed something was wrong. We were sitting inside our temporary shelter while organizing supplies. You saw them. I looked up. What? Your family. I did not answer. She already knew. You found them. I looked back at the supplies in front of me. Yes. And I stayed silent. Yirin waited. She was good at that. She never forced people to speak before they were ready. Finally, I said, "They're alive. That should make you happy." I looked at her. Should it? She understood immediately. What happened? For a long time, I said nothing. I had told myself I would never explain. Not because I wanted to hide, because saying it aloud made it real again. But eventually I spoke. I died once. Yirin frowned. What? I looked down. Not literally. Not the way you think. I paused. I mean, the person I was before died. I told her about my family. Not every detail. Not yet. But enough. I told her about the shelter. The medicine. The locked door. The choice they made. Yirin listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet. Then she asked, "And you still came looking for them?" That question hurt, because I did not know the answer. Maybe some part of me wanted proof. Proof that they regretted it. Proof that they were sorry. Proof that the person I loved still existed somewhere. I don't know. Yirin looked at me. That's the most honest answer you've given. The next day, I watched my family again. This time, I saw something different. Not just their weakness, their dependence. Without me, they had no plan, no supplies, no understanding of how quickly things could get worse. My father argued with other survivors about food distribution. Sujin tried to convince people she knew someone who could help. Someone like me. But I was not there. And for the first time, they had to face reality. A part of me wanted to walk forward, to reveal myself, to say, "I'm alive. You were wrong. You left me. Look at me now." But I stopped myself, because that was still about them. Even my anger was still giving them control over my choices. I did not need them to understand my value. I needed to understand it myself. So I walked away. 2 days later, everything changed. A new message came through survivor channels. A major shelter network had been established in Seoul. At first, people celebrated. A stable shelter meant hope. But then the details appeared. The shelters were controlled by a private military organization. They were deciding who entered, who received supplies, who was considered valuable. And I recognized the name. The same organization I had seen preparing before the apocalypse. The same group that had been collecting resources while everyone else remained unaware. I stared at the message. The apocalypse was already revealing its second battle. The first battle was against the Hollows. The second was against people who believed survival gave them the right to control everyone else. And now I understood something. My family's betrayal was not the only thing I had to deal with. The world itself had changed. Power belonged to whoever prepared first. And I had been preparing. That evening, Yirin placed a radio report in front of me. "They're looking for someone." I looked at her. "Who?" She turned the radio volume up. The message repeated. A survivor organization was searching for a person with emergency logistics knowledge. Someone who understood supply systems. Someone who knew where resources were hidden. Someone named Kang Min-jae. I stared at the radio. They knew my name. The people controlling the shelters were looking for me. And for the first time since returning to the past, I realized something. My preparation had made me stronger, but it had also made me visible. Chapter 7. The Secret Behind the Collapse. The moment I heard my name on the radio, I knew hiding was no longer a perfect option. For the first time since my regression, someone else had connected the pieces. They knew there was a person moving through Seoul with information nobody else had. They knew someone had prepared before the apocalypse. And they knew that person was me. I turned off the radio. The room became quiet. Yirin watched me carefully. "They know you." I nodded. "Yes." "Why?" I looked at the maps spread across the table. The emergency routes. The supply locations. The shelters. The things I had been trying to use to survive. They're afraid of what I know. In my first life, I had believed the apocalypse was a random disaster. A terrible event that happened without warning. A tragedy nobody could prevent. But after returning, I started noticing things that did not make sense. The unusual supply movements before the disaster. The private groups preparing in advance. The emergency systems that seemed too organized to be created after the collapse. Someone had known something. The question was, how much did they know? Year in, and I began investigating. We did not rush toward the shelter organization. That would have been a mistake. Powerful groups survived because they expected people to act emotionally. They wanted enemies to attack first. They wanted proof that those enemies were dangerous. We needed information, not anger, not revenge. Information. The first clue came from my old company. During my investigation of emergency supply routes, I noticed something unusual. Several months before the apocalypse, my company had received special requests. Large inventory transfers, unusual storage contracts, emergency equipment purchases. At the time, nobody questioned it. Companies handled strange requests all the time. But now, looking back with the knowledge of what happened, the pattern was obvious. Someone had been preparing, and they had used normal business systems to hide it. I contacted Park Jun-ho. He answered after only a few seconds. Min-jae. His voice sounded relieved. You're alive. I paused. He already knew. How did you know? People talk. He sighed, especially when someone survives impossible situations. I looked around before speaking. I need information. What kind? About emergency preparation before the Red Winter event. The line became silent. That silence told me everything. You noticed. It was not a question. You knew something. Jun-ho exhaled. I suspected. We met inside an abandoned office building away from major survivor routes. Jun-ho looked older than he had before the apocalypse. Everyone did. The world had a way of removing unnecessary things. Pride, comfort, illusions. You need to understand something, he said. Before the disaster, some people believed something was coming. How many? Not many. Government, some officials, some private organizations, people with access. I looked at him. And ordinary people? He shook his head. No. That answer bothered me, because it meant the disaster did not only destroy society. It divided people before society even collapsed. Some people prepared. Everyone else was left behind. Jun-ho gave me access to old records he had saved. Emergency contracts, communication logs, supply requests. I reviewed everything carefully. Then I found something. A company name connected to multiple emergency purchases. The same organization controlling the survivor shelters. The same organization that had been searching for me. I felt my expression change. What? Yirin noticed. I turned the screen toward her. This group knew. The more we investigated, the clearer the picture became. They had not caused the apocalypse. That was not what I found, but they had known it was coming. And instead of sharing that information, they prepared privately. They secured resources. They built shelters. They protected their own people, while everyone else continued living normally. I understood survival. I understood protecting people you cared about. But this was different. They did not prepare. They controlled. Then we found something that made everything personal. A shelter record. Not from this timeline. From the first one, the emergency shelter where my family abandoned me. I stared at the document. The location. The security system. The management company. Everything matched. The shelter was not random. It was controlled by the same organization. My hands tightened, because suddenly, the memory I had tried to understand became clearer. My family had made a terrible choice. But they had made that choice inside a system designed around scarcity. A system where someone decided who was worth saving. Yirin looked at me. Min-jae. I did not answer. She knew what I was thinking. This does not excuse what they did. I looked at her. She continued. Your sister still made that decision. I nodded. I know. That was important. Because for a moment, I felt the temptation to blame everything on the organization. It would have been easier. If someone else was responsible, maybe I could forgive my family. But the truth was more complicated. The organization created the situation. My sister made the choice. Both things were true. We continued collecting evidence. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I wanted the truth. A world after the apocalypse needed rules. Without rules, power belonged to whoever was strongest. and I had already seen what happened when people were allowed to decide who mattered. Days passed. The organization became more aggressive. Their broadcasts warned survivors against independent groups. They claimed unofficial settlements were dangerous. They claimed only their shelters could provide safety. But people were beginning to question them, because rumors spread. Survivors talked. They talked about missing supplies, closed shelters, people who were denied entry, stories that did not match the organization's public image. One evening, a new broadcast interrupted every available radio channel. The message was short, direct. A warning: the individual known as Kang Min-jae is considered a person of interest. Anyone providing him assistance will be investigated. Yirin looked at me. They're scared. I listened to the message again. No, they were not scared. They were threatened, because they knew something I knew. Information was power, and I had information they could not control. That night, I looked over the evidence we had collected. The supply records, the contracts, the shelter information, the communication logs, everything connected. The apocalypse had created a new world, but the same old problems remained. Greed, control, people deciding others were disposable. I had spent my first life trying to survive inside that world. This time I was going to challenge it. But before I could challenge anyone, I needed to stop hiding. The next morning, I made a decision. I would reveal myself. Not completely. Not emotionally. Strategically. The world needed to know one thing. The person they thought was dead was alive. And he had proof. Chapter 8. The man they thought was dead. For weeks, I had survived by staying invisible. That was the strategy. Observe first. Act second. Let everyone else reveal their intentions before I revealed mine. In the old timeline, I was always reacting. Someone needed medicine, and I searched for it. Someone needed protection, and I provided it. A disaster happened, and I arrived after the damage was already done. This time was different. I was ahead, but staying hidden forever had its own weakness. If people controlled the story about me, they controlled the future. The organization searching for me already understood that. They were creating a version of Kang Min-jae before anyone even met me. A dangerous person, a suspicious survivor, someone who knew too much. I could not allow that. I decided to reveal myself. Not because I wanted attention, because I needed control. The first step was creating a safe place, a settlement that followed different rules from the shelters controlled by the organization. A place where people were not treated like numbers. A place where resources were managed fairly. Not freely, not carelessly, fairly. There was a difference. Survival did not mean giving everything away. It meant making sure the right people could continue. The location I chose was an abandoned underground logistics facility near Central Seoul. It was not perfect. The structure needed repairs. The security systems were damaged. But it had advantages: multiple exits, storage space, access routes, a defensible position. Most importantly, it was connected to supply paths I understood. I began organizing. Food storage, medical areas, communication points, emergency rules. Every decision came from experience, not theory. The first survivors who joined were suspicious. They had every reason to be. The apocalypse had taught people not to trust easily. A stranger offering safety usually had a hidden reason. I understood that. So I did not promise them miracles. I did not tell them everything would be easy. I simply told them the truth. We survived together, but everyone contributes. Some people liked that. Some people left. That was fine. A group built on forced loyalty would collapse eventually. I had already experienced what happened when people stayed together only because they needed something. Yirin watched me create the settlement. One evening, while we were organizing medical supplies, she said, "You're different." I looked at her. "You said that before." "I know." She placed a box on the shelf. "But before, you were different in a way that worried me." "What about now?" She thought for a moment. "Before, you looked like someone trying to carry the entire world alone. And now? Now you look like someone who understands he doesn't have to." I did not answer, because she was right. The old Min-jae thought sacrifice was proof of love. The new Min-jae understood that people who cared about him would not require him to destroy himself. News about my settlement spread quickly, not because we advertised, because people noticed. A group with food, a group with medicine, a group that did not abandon injured survivors. In a world where people were desperate, actions mattered more than words. Soon, survivors started asking one question. Is it true? Is Kang Min-jae alive? The answer reached my family. I found out through a survivor message network. My sister had heard. She knew. For a moment, I wondered what she felt. Relief? Fear? Regret? I did not know. And honestly, I was not sure I cared anymore. That surprised me, because in the past, her feelings controlled me. If Sujin was upset, I tried to fix it. If she was struggling, I helped. If she was afraid, I protected her. But now, I was finally seeing her as another person, not my responsibility. Of course, Sujin reacted exactly how I expected. She believed I would come. A message reached me, not directly, through another survivor. Your sister wants to meet you. I stared at the message. Yirin noticed. You don't want to? No. Why? I looked down. Because I know what she wants. What? I answered honestly. She wants the person I used to be. A few days later, someone came to my settlement. Not Sujin, a former shelter officer. An older man named Kim Sung-hwan. He had worked at the emergency shelter during the first timeline. At first, I did not recognize him, but he recognized me. You're Kang Min-jae. I looked at him carefully. Yes. His expression changed, like he was seeing a ghost. I thought you were dead. I was. He became silent. Then he lowered his head. I need to tell you something. We moved to a private room. Yirin stayed nearby. Not because she did not trust him. Because after everything that happened, caution was necessary. The man placed a small storage device on the table. What is this? Security footage. My heart stopped for a moment. From where? He looked at me. The shelter. I did not touch it. I already knew what was inside. The moment I saw it, I knew. This was the proof. The thing I had been missing. The thing that could answer every question I had carried since my death. Why are you giving this to me? His expression became painful. Because I heard what happened. He looked away. I knew the truth. My voice became colder. And you did nothing? He accepted the accusation. I was afraid. That answer did not make me forgive him. But I understood it. Fear changed people. That was one thing the apocalypse had proven. I should have opened that door. He pushed the device toward me. I should have stopped her. I picked up the recording. For weeks, I had imagined this moment. I imagined anger. I imagined wanting revenge. I imagined destroying everyone responsible. But holding the proof in my hand, I felt something different. A strange calm. Because now I knew. I was not crazy. I was not exaggerating. I was not blaming people unfairly. It happened. They chose. Before he left, Kim Sung-hwan stopped at the door. There's something else. I looked at him. I heard your sister tell the guards not to open the door. The room became quiet. I already knew. But hearing it from another person made it real in a different way. He continued. She said. He hesitated. Then he finished. She said Min-jae always survives. After he left, I sat alone with the recording. The evidence was finally in my hands. The truth I had been carrying alone. Tomorrow, I would watch it. Tomorrow, I would see the moment my family chose my death. But this time, I would not be the person outside the door. I would be the person deciding what happened next. Chapter 9. The recording that broke the family. I did not watch the recording immediately. For several hours, it stayed on the table in front of me. A small storage device. That was all it looked like. But I knew what it contained. A few minutes of footage. A few minutes that explained the moment my entire life changed. A few minutes that could either give me closure or reopen the wound I had spent weeks trying to close. Yirin found me sitting there late at night. The settlement was quiet. Most people were asleep. Only the emergency lights remained on. She looked at the device on the table. You haven't watched it. I shook my head. No. Why? I looked at the small piece of technology. Because part of me already knows. Yirin sat across from me. And another part of you wants to know everything. I nodded. She understood. That was something I appreciated about her. She never pretended pain disappeared just because someone decided to move forward. Some wounds needed to be faced. not ignored. I finally inserted the device. The old security footage appeared. The quality was poor. The image was dark. But I recognized the place immediately. The emergency shelter. The same entrance. The same glass door. The same hallway where I had spent my final moments. For a second, I felt like I was back there. Cold. Weak. Desperate. But this time I was watching from the other side. The footage showed the chaos inside the shelter. People arguing. Guards trying to maintain order. Families begging for entry. The situation was exactly as I remembered. Limited space. Limited supplies. Fear everywhere. Then I saw myself. Outside. Carrying the medicine. Knocking on the door. Calling for them. Even though the recording had no sound, I knew what I was saying. I knew the desperation in my voice. Because I remembered feeling it. Then Sujin appeared. I stopped breathing for a moment. Seeing her again was different. Memory could soften things. Time could make you question yourself. But the recording removed all doubt. She was there. She spoke with the guards. She knew I was outside. She knew I was alive. The footage showed her looking toward the entrance, then looking back at the people inside. She made a choice. I watched the conversation carefully. The audio was damaged, but parts were clear. We can't open it. Someone argued. He has medicine. Sujin looked toward the entrance. Then she said the words that stayed with me. There isn't enough space. The guard hesitated. He's your brother. Her expression changed. Not hatred. That would have been easier. It was fear. Pure survival instinct. If we let him in, everyone inside could be at risk. I closed my eyes. Not because I was surprised. Because I was finally hearing the justification she had given herself. In her mind, she was not the villain. She was the person making a difficult decision. That was what made it worse. Because people rarely believe they're doing something wrong. They find reasons. They create explanations. They convince themselves they had no choice. The recording continued. A guard mentioned that I was still alive, that I might survive outside. And then Sujin said something I had already heard through the glass. He always survives. The room felt colder, because those words explained everything. She did not believe I was unimportant. She believed I was expendable because I was strong. My strength became the reason nobody protected me. The recording ended. I removed the device. For several minutes, I said nothing. Yirin did not interrupt. Finally, she asked, "What do you feel?" I looked at the screen. The answer should have been anger. Maybe hatred. But strangely, it was something else. Exhaustion. I spent so much time wondering if I misunderstood. I looked at her. If maybe they were trapped. If maybe they had no choice. My voice became quieter. But they did have a choice. Yirin nodded. Yes. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to reveal the truth. Not because I wanted to destroy my family. Not because I wanted people to hate Sujin. I wanted something simpler. Accountability. The apocalypse had already taken enough from people. It did not need to take away the truth too. I began gathering evidence. The recording was the most important piece. But it was not enough. People could question it. They could claim it was incomplete. They could say fear caused mistakes. So I collected everything. The shelter footage. Emergency communication records. Witness statements. Supply logs. Anything connected to that night. The communication records were especially important. They proved something my family could not deny. I was alive outside the shelter. They knew. There was no misunderstanding. No confusion. No accident. They had made a decision with full information. Park Junho helped verify the records. He studied the documents carefully. This is enough to prove what happened. I looked at him. But he understood. But people don't always accept the truth just because it exists. He was right. Evidence mattered. But people also protected their beliefs, especially when the truth made them look bad. As I prepared for the public hearing, Sujin contacted me directly. The message was simple. We need to talk. I stared at it. The old me would have replied immediately. The old me would have searched for a way to fix everything. But that person was gone. I answered. After the hearing, a few minutes later, another message appeared. Min-jae, please. I know you're angry. I read it. Then another. I was scared. I closed my eyes. Because I believed that. She was scared. but fear explained a choice. It did not erase it. The Survivor Council announced an upcoming meeting, not just about my family, about the shelter organization. The same people controlling resources across Seoul were beginning to move against independent groups. They accused us of stealing supplies. They accused us of creating instability. They wanted survivors to believe only they could provide safety. The timing was obvious. They knew I had evidence. They knew I was becoming influential. And they knew if people trusted me, their control would weaken. The next battle would not be fought with weapons. It would be fought with truth. That night, I stood in front of the evidence wall inside my settlement. Every document had a place. Every event had a connection. The old Min-jae would have been afraid. He would have worried about hurting his family, about what people would think, about whether he was being too harsh. But the man standing there was different. I had already lost everything once. I was not going to lose myself again. The next morning, I walked into the council meeting. Hundreds of survivors were waiting. The organization's representatives were there. My family was there. Sujin looked at me. For a moment, I saw the sister I remembered, the child I protected, the person I once would have sacrificed everything for. Then I remembered the door. I remembered the choice. I walked forward, not as her brother, not as someone begging to be understood, but as someone who finally understood his own worth. Chapter 10. When the strongest enemy lost everything. The Survivor Council meeting was the largest gathering I had seen since the apocalypse began. Hundreds of people filled the abandoned convention hall that had become a temporary decision center for Seoul's remaining survivors. Everyone had a reason for being there. Some wanted answers. Some wanted protection. Some wanted to know whether the stories they had heard about the shelter organization were true. And some were simply afraid. Fear was the one thing everyone still shared. The world had changed, but that part had not. Across the room sat the representatives of the organization controlling the major shelter network. They looked nothing like the desperate survivors outside. Their clothes were clean. Their equipment was organized. Their people stood around them like security officers. They wanted everyone to see the same message. They were in control. They were prepared. They were necessary. That image was the reason they had survived. Not just because they had resources, because they controlled what people believed. Their leader, a man named Lee Hyun-tae, stood first. He was not a loud person. That was what made him dangerous. People who wanted power rarely needed to shout. They only needed others to listen. "We understand many survivors are confused," he said. "The collapse of society has created fear and misinformation." His eyes moved across the room. "We have worked to protect lives and maintain order." Then he looked directly at me. "Kang Min-jae has created unnecessary conflict." The room became tense. I expected this. They would not attack the evidence first. They would attack the person presenting it. "He possesses unknown information," Lee continued. "He has taken control of supplies without authorization." Some survivors looked toward me. Doubt appeared. Exactly as they planned. The organization understood something important. People were willing to follow whoever seemed safest. And right now, they were trying to make me look like a threat. I did not respond immediately. That confused them, because they expected anger. They expected me to defend myself emotionally. The old Min-jae might have. He would have explained. He would have tried to convince everyone. But I had learned something. Truth did not become stronger because you shouted it. It became stronger because you could prove it. Lee continued. "He claims to care about survivors, but he refuses to share resources freely." Someone in the crowd asked, "Is that true?" The question spread. I finally stepped forward. "Yes." The room quieted. "I do not share resources without planning." Some people looked surprised. I continued, "Because empty promises do not keep people alive." I pointed toward the storage records behind me. Food without management disappears. Medicine without organization runs out. Shelters without rules become death traps. I looked around the room. Survival is not about giving everything away on the first day. It is about making sure something remains on the last day. Then I turned toward the organization. And that is exactly why we are here. I placed the first document on the table. Their supply records. The room became quiet. These records show emergency supplies were collected before the Red Winter event. People started whispering. Lee's expression changed slightly. Only slightly. But I noticed. Because he knew what was coming. I continued. You told survivors that nobody could have prepared. I placed another document down. But your organization had already secured resources. The documents showed emergency purchases, storage contracts, transportation arrangements, all completed before the disaster. A survivor stood up. You knew. The question was directed at Lee. He remained calm. We prepared for possible emergencies. That answer was expected, and it was reasonable. Almost. That would be understandable, I said. Preparation is not the problem. I placed another file down. The problem is what happened afterward. The room became silent. You knew the disaster was coming. The evidence showed private supply movement, shelter planning, restricted access, information that was never shared publicly. You protected your own people. I looked around, but everyone else was left unprepared. Lee finally interrupted. You have no right to judge survival decisions. His voice was colder now. This world does not allow everyone to be saved. I looked at him. Those words sounded familiar. Too familiar. Because they were the same excuse my family used. The same excuse people used when they wanted to make selfish choices sound necessary. You're right, I said. Not everyone can be saved. I paused. But that does not mean someone else gets to decide who is disposable. Then Park Joon-ho stepped forward. He presented professional verification of the records. He explained the logistics systems, the contracts, the timeline. He was not emotional. That made his testimony stronger. This was not revenge. This was evidence. Then Yirin presented medical reports. Reports from survivors who had been denied access to certain shelters. People who died because resources existed but were restricted. She did not exaggerate. She did not accuse without proof. She simply presented facts. And facts were harder to fight. The room changed slowly. That was the moment I realized something. The organization's greatest weapon had never been supplies. It was trust. And now they were losing it. Lee tried one final argument. You think exposing us helps people? He looked around. Without our shelters, thousands would have died. He was right about one thing. Their shelters had saved lives. That was why the situation was complicated. They were not completely evil. They had done necessary things. But necessary actions did not erase harmful choices. A person could save lives and still abuse power. Both things could be true. The council members discussed for hours. No one made a decision quickly. They reviewed evidence. They questioned witnesses. They checked records. That was important to me, because justice built on anger was temporary. Justice built on proof lasted. By evening, the decision was announced. The organization would lose control over independent shelter authority. Their resource management would be investigated. Their leadership rights were removed. They would still receive basic support like any other survivor group, but they would no longer decide who deserved to live. For the first time since the apocalypse began, the organization looked powerless. Not because someone attacked them, because people stopped believing them. After the meeting, Lee passed by me. He stopped. You think you won? I looked at him. No. He seemed surprised. I think people finally know the truth. That was the difference. I was not trying to replace him. I was trying to make sure nobody had that kind of control again. That night, my settlement celebrated. But I did not. Because I knew something else was waiting. The organization had lost. The truth was public. The biggest enemy was defeated. But one person still remained. The person whose decision had started my entire journey. My sister. I returned to my settlement late that night. Someone was waiting near the entrance. I recognized her immediately. Soo-jin. She looked different. Not powerful. Not confident. Just tired. She looked at me. Appa. I stopped. For years, that word had meant responsibility, protection, sacrifice. Now it only carried memories. I need to talk to you. I said nothing. She lowered her head. I know I don't deserve this. The old me would have stepped forward. The old me would have forgiven before hearing the apology. But that person was gone. Soo-jin looked at me. Please. I'm sorry. For the first time since the apocalypse began, my sister was asking me for something that was not money, Not protection. Not a solution. She was asking me to listen, and I did not know yet whether I could. Chapter 11. The sister who wanted her brother back. Soo-jin stood outside my settlement entrance for several minutes before I finally let her inside. Not because I had forgiven her. Not because I was ready to forget. Because I wanted to hear what she had to say. There was a difference. For years, I had listened to my family because I felt responsible for them. This time, I was listening because I chose to. That was something I had never done before. We sat in a small room away from the others. No audience. No survivors watching. No public judgment. Just the two of us. The same way it used to be before everything fell apart. Except we were not the same people anymore. Soo-jin looked around the room. She saw the organized supplies. The schedules. The maps. The people who trusted me. She saw the life I had built without her. You really did it. I looked at her. Did what? She lowered her eyes. You survived. The words were simple, but they carried years of misunderstanding. Because she had always believed survival was something I was naturally good at. Like breathing. Like walking. She never understood the cost. I was wrong. That was the first thing she said. No excuses. No explanation. Just those words. I waited. Because apologies were easy. Understanding was harder. She continued. When the shelter door closed, her voice became quieter. I told myself I was protecting everyone. I looked at her. Were you? She closed her eyes. I don't know anymore. That answer surprised me. Because for the first time, she sounded like someone questioning herself. Not someone defending herself. She explained what happened after I disappeared. At first, everyone expected me to return. Just like she said, they believed I would find a way. They believed I would appear with supplies. A solution. A plan. But days passed. Then weeks. And I never came. Because I was dead. The person they depended on was gone. And they finally had to face a world without the person who always fixed everything. My whole life, I thought you were strong because nothing could hurt you. She looked at me. But I was wrong. I stayed silent. You were strong because you kept letting people hurt you. That sentence affected me more than I expected. Because it was true. I had mistaken endurance for happiness. I thought carrying more weight proved I was valuable. But all it proved was that people learned I would carry it. I'm sorry. She said it again. This time, her voice broke. I know saying sorry doesn't change anything. No. I answered. It doesn't. She nodded. I know. The honesty made it harder. Because I wanted to be angry. Anger was easier. Anger created distance. But seeing her regret the choice did not erase what happened. Both things could exist. She could regret it, and I could still be hurt. My biggest fear was losing everything. She looked down. I thought if I lost that shelter, I would die. I listened, but I never thought about what I was taking from you. That was the part she needed to understand. Not that she was afraid. Everyone was afraid. Fear was normal. The problem was what people chose because of that fear. My whole life, I was there for you. My voice was calm, not angry, just honest. When Mom died, I took care of you. She nodded. I know. When Dad had problems, I handled them. I know. When you needed help, I helped. Her eyes filled with tears. I know. I looked at her. But you never saw me as someone who could need help. She had no answer. Because there was no defense against that. My father also came to see me later. Kang Min-jae sick. The man who had watched the shelter door stay closed. He looked older. Smaller. The apocalypse had taken away the authority he once carried. He sat across from me quietly. I failed you. That was the first thing he said. I did not respond. I spent years believing you could handle anything. He looked at his hands. I thought depending on you was the same as trusting you. I looked at him. It wasn't. He nodded. I know. I expected this moment to feel satisfying. The moment where the people who hurt me finally admitted they were wrong. But it did not feel like victory. It felt like closure. Because I realized something important. I had spent so much time wanting them to understand my pain. But I no longer needed their understanding to move forward. Soo-jin asked the question I knew was coming. Can you forgive me? I looked at her. The old me would have said yes. Immediately. Because forgiveness was another thing I gave away too easily. But forgiveness was not the same as pretending nothing happened. I don't know. She looked surprised. I continued. I don't hate you. That was true. I don't want you to suffer. Also true. But I can't become the person I was before. Her eyes lowered. I understand. I gave them support, but not the way I used to. They received basic supplies. A safe place to survive. The same chance I gave other survivors. Nothing more. I was no longer their personal shield. Their emergency solution. Their sacrifice. That role was over. When Soo-jin left, she stopped near the entrance. For a moment, she looked like the little sister I remembered, the child I protected. Then she looked at the settlement behind me, the people who trusted me, the future I created. I lost you before I realized how important you were. I looked at her. No. She looked confused. You lost me when you decided I wasn't worth saving. The words were painful, but they were honest. And honesty was something we both needed. After she left, Yirin found me outside. You okay? I looked toward the road where Soo-jin had disappeared. Yes. She smiled slightly. That's the first time you answered that quickly. I looked at the settlement. The people working together. The future we were building. I think I finally stopped waiting for them to choose me. Yirin nodded. Good. For the first time since my regression, I felt free. Not because my enemies were defeated. Not because my family apologized. Because I had finally accepted something. My life did not begin when people valued me. It began when I valued myself. But the world was not finished testing us. A new emergency report arrived that evening. A massive winter storm was approaching Seoul. A disaster unlike anything survivors had faced since the Red Winter event. The settlement needed preparation. Everyone looked toward me. But this time it was different. They were not looking at me because they expected me to sacrifice myself. They were looking at me because they trusted my decisions. And that was something I was willing to carry. Chapter 12. The Future I Chose. The winter warning arrived 3 days after my conversation with Soo-jin. At first, nobody understood how serious it was. After everything we had already survived, people had become numb to bad news. The apocalypse had already taken everything from us once. Another disaster felt almost expected. But I knew better, because I had lived through the first timeline. And I remembered what happened when people underestimated nature. The Red Winter event was not just the beginning of the apocalypse. The extreme cold that followed was one of the reasons so many survivors died afterward. The hollows were dangerous. But so was a world without electricity, without transportation, without enough food, without preparation. I gathered the settlement leaders immediately. The old Min-jae would have tried to handle everything alone. He would have created a plan. He would have worked until exhaustion. Then he would have hidden how tired he was. Not anymore. A leader who carried everything alone eventually became another weakness. So I created teams. Supply management, medical response, shelter reinforcement, communication, transportation. Everyone had a responsibility. Everyone had value. Yirin stood beside me during the preparations. She managed the medical division. Her experience as a former military medic became one of our greatest advantages. She understood something I had forgotten. Survival was not only about staying alive. It was about protecting the people who were still alive. That difference mattered. The storm arrived faster than expected. Temperatures dropped within hours. Roads became dangerous. Communication systems weakened. Outside the settlement, the city disappeared beneath heavy snow and darkness. The Seoul I knew became something almost impossible to recognize. But inside our walls, people were prepared. Not because we were stronger, because we worked together. During the worst part of the storm, one of our communication systems failed. A supply team was trapped outside. The old fear returned immediately. The fear from my first life. The memory of being outside a shelter. Being abandoned. For a moment, I felt that same helplessness. But then I looked around. People were waiting for instructions. Not because they wanted me to solve everything. Because they trusted me. There was a difference. I gave the order. The rescue team moved. They returned with everyone alive. And standing there watching those people walk back through the entrance, I realized something. I had spent my first life trying to become someone people could not abandon. But the answer was never becoming stronger alone. The answer was finding people who chose not to abandon you. Months passed. The worst of the winter ended. Slowly, Seoul began rebuilding. Not the old Seoul. That world was gone. But something new. Survivor settlements became communities. Communities became organized regions. People began creating systems again. Rules, trade, education, medical networks. A new society was forming, and I was part of building it. The truth about the shelter betrayal eventually became known across survivor networks. The evidence was released. The recordings, the communication records, the witness statements. Nobody could deny what happened anymore. Sujin did not become hated by everyone. Life was more complicated than that. Some people understood her fear. Some people judged her decision. Both reactions existed, but the one thing she could never do again was pretend it never happened. The truth remained. The organization that controlled the shelters lost its influence completely. Their resources were redistributed under Survivor Council oversight. The leaders who abused their authority faced consequences. Not revenge. Not punishment for the sake of suffering. Accountability. The same thing I had wanted from the beginning. Park Joon-ho continued helping rebuild emergency systems. The same skills he had once used to prepare for disasters were now used to create a safer future. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if people like him had been given more power before the apocalypse. Maybe things would have been different. But I learned something important. Regret could teach you, but living inside regret would destroy you. Yirin and I remained together. Not because we needed each other to survive. Because we chose each other. That difference mattered. She was the first person who saw me as something other than a solution. Not a provider. Not a protector. Not someone who existed only when others needed something. Just Min-jae. And that meant more than she probably realized. 1 year after the apocalypse began, I returned to the old shelter. The same place where my first life ended. The building was abandoned now. The glass door was still damaged. The entrance where I had begged to be let inside was covered in dust. I stood there for a long time. I expected anger. I expected pain. But what I felt was different. Peace. Because that place no longer represented my death. It represented the moment my old life ended. And the moment I finally understood something. I was never worthless. I was never disposable. I was simply surrounded by people who had mistaken my kindness for weakness. I remembered the question I had heard when I died. If you were given another chance, would you make the same choices? Back then, I thought the answer was simple. No. I would not help them. I would not trust them. I would not sacrifice myself. But standing there years later, I realized the answer had changed. I would still help people. I would still protect others. I would still care. Because those things were not my weakness. The mistake was not being kind. The mistake was believing kindness meant destroying myself. I walked away from the shelter, the same place where I had once been left behind. But this time, I walked away alive. Ahead of me was the city we were rebuilding, a city filled with people who knew my name. Not because they needed something from me, because they respected me. For the first time in my life, I was not surviving for someone else. I was living for myself. And that was the future I chose.